Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Jordan Center for Persian Studies. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Yuhan Sohrab-Dinshaw Vevaina, who's going to be speaking in the series called Crucible of Empires, Minorities of the Sasanian Empire. This is a project that Professor Simcha Gross here at UCI was the mastermind behind it with Professor Vevaina at Oxford, where we would do a sort of a exchange, thank you, between the two universities and discuss matters pertaining to the Sasanian Empire and the religious communities. And we're hoping that some of these lectures will be published in the Journal of Late Antiquity. So that is the plan. And this is our second or third, I think, talk in this series. I should say before I introduce Professor Vevaina that tomorrow we were scheduled to have Dr. Sergei Minov from Oxford here. However, since he is Russian, his visa situation was a bit more difficult, hence he wasn't able to come. So we will not have a lecture tomorrow, but we're fortunate to have Professor Vevaina here, who is the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies, and I think it's the only place on earth that has such a position, in the Oriental Institute, and the governing body fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Oxford, where he has been teaching since almost 2 years ago now. He received his PhD from the Department of Near Languages and Cultures, or Civilizations, Civilizations at Harvard University, where he mainly studied with Dr. Proz Sherve, professor of Iranian. He's the Irvine professor now emeritus, and then served as a postdoctoral fellow, lecturing on Old Iranian and at Harvard as well from 2007 and 2009. We were fortunate to have him here as a research fellow at UCI in the spring of 2009, where I got to know him well. Subsequently, he was appointed as a fellow of National Endowment for Humanities for the National Council for the Humanities in 2010. In 2011, he began a 5-year position at Stanford University as a lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies. He then taught at the University of Toronto as the Yarshoter Assistant Professor of Avestan and Pahlavi Languages, 2016 and 2017 academic year. And of course, during his time, he has taught a number of courses related to ancient and late antique Iran, including Old and Young Avestan, Old Persian and Middle Persian languages and literatures, and courses on Achaemenid and the Sasanian Empire, and courses, of course, on Zoroastrianism, ancient and contemporary, for both undergraduate and graduate students. He's currently working on a monograph on Zoroastrian scriptural interpretation in late antiquity and the early Islamic centuries. Last but not least, he is the co-editor of the Wiley Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism. Thanks to Bandar is looking to find a place. If you'd like to know something about Zoroastrianism beyond the websites and the online sources, something concrete, I would suggest you purchase this the Wiley volume to the study of Zoroastrian world. It's written by, I don't know how many chapters, but it's quite 33 people, and it deals with all aspects of Zoroastrianism. And really, this is the latest study on the field. Today, he's going to be talking about one is the path of truth, those of others are all non-paths, disciplining selves and critiquing others in Sasanian Iran. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So,
I should say a few things about how this talk and this seminar series came together, Professor Gross and Professor Daniel and I have been discussing this for many, many months now, that we wanted to do something that really spread over 2 campuses and basically addressed sort of the major question about minorities, religious tolerance, intolerance, and all that comes with that. So putting the thing together wasn't particularly as easy as we had hoped, because sometimes finding the right speakers and the right slots, people who can talk across the different communities, whether it has something with Manichaeism, something with Christianity, Judaism, the various religious minorities, communities. And I thought to myself that from my own stuff, what I will try and do is do what I more or less always do, which is excavate the thought world, so to speak, of the Zoroastrian priests, and try to get at how they use their scriptural material as a cultural resource when they're dealing with others. So that approach has certain limits, it has certain advantages. I'll try and do a little bit and sort of contextualize that before I get going right away. But let me start by pointing out where this actual line comes from. This is one of the last lines of Yasna 72.11, the very end of the Yasna liturgy. And I actually came across this line in the colophon of the Denkard, which is what I'll come to in a couple of minutes. But and so we have this in both Avestan and in Pahlavi. I've translated it a little bit differently here as I have in the title. But essentially, this is a statement that exists in the Avesta. So it is exceedingly old, and it has nothing to do with Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, all the people that we would then have it apply to in the context of Sasanian Iran. But this, I think, is partly what is so fascinating about the Zoroastrian material, that we have so much material that exists from the ancient archaic sources that gets borrowed and retasked to make claims about contemporary lived experiences. Now, having said that, what I'm not going to do, and what I mean, perhaps it's not the most scientific approach, but what I didn't want to do was to give you the same old inscription of Kerdir and give you the same quote about him persecuting all the people. So I've skipped everything that is essentially from the political side or from the inscriptional side. So for all practical purposes, everything that I'm dealing with is the Pahlavi. I've sort of tried to excavate it from the Pahlavi sources. Now that comes obviously with certain basic historiographical problematics. So let me get to that. The question is, how do we use a source like the Denkard as either a source or a resource? And I think that the point here is, it was it's a historiographical source for us, but it was also, primarily speaking, a resource for them to draw on in terms of how they produced their scholastic literature. So let me say a little bit about the Denkard, because I think this is, it might be familiar to some, but maybe not to all. So the Denkard is the largest surviving text that we have in Pahlavi literature, at approximately 169,000 words. There was originally 9 books, of which books 1 and 2 have completely been lost. We have nothing said about them. We don't even have any descriptions of them, nothing like that. The colophon that we have, that basically tells us when the manuscript was written, the earliest manuscript we have, is from 1020 CE in Baghdad. So this is another really important point to keep in mind. When we're talking about inscriptions, we are talking about properly made in the Sasanian period, unless they were produced extremely late, which can happen, of course. But when we're talking about Pahlavi literature, all our material is essentially had been written down in the early Islamic centuries. So we always have to ask ourselves that when they're critiquing an other, is the other Islam, or is the other some other community like Jews or Christians or Manichaeans or Mazdakites in the before 650? This is a basic historiographical challenge that there's no easy way around. And just because one text has something that makes it that's clearly Islamic doesn't mean that the material right next to it before or after has to be such either. This is because the material in a sense is, I don't want to go so far as to call it a hodgepodge, but it is supposedly taken from all these various sources. So there's no easy way to say that this passage here is clearly X. I mean, yes, if it has Islam, we know that it was not written down or produced in the Sasanian period. But if it is something Sasanian, doesn't mean necessarily that it doesn't have an Islamic influence. So, what I wanted to talk about today was Denkard Book 8, which is a little bit different than what I normally do. Normally I talk about Book 9, but this time I think 8 is where I want to go, because Denkard Book 8 is this fascinating table of contents, so to speak, which has the entire tradition, the Dane, the religious tradition, divided into 21 nusks or bundles. And essentially the argument is that we had a Western original, one of 21, and a Pahlavi translation / commentary. So essentially we would have, theoretically what they are telling us is that there were 42 texts, so to speak, that captured the vast bulk of the scholastic literature and learning of the ancient Avestan literature. That is, it's both, the claim that they're making is that not only is this Avestan, but it's also the Pahlavi late antique understanding of the Avestan. Now this again may seem very basic and obvious for people, but one of the things that you constantly see in the literature is people say the 21 nusks of the Avesta. And this is completely problematic simply because the texts never say 21 nusks of the Avesta. They say 21 nusks of the Dane. The question is, what do we mean by Dane? Now, plenty has been written about this, and obviously we have to sort of deal with the fascinating problem of the word deen in Persian. Does it come from Arabic or is it coming from Pahlavi? That is, this is the great question. Is this material coming from the Semitic side or from the Iranian? Or in a sense, have these two traditions which have similar sounding words coalesced and you have it working both ways? Now, I don't want to deal with that today. I think that's sort of a different question because that doesn't really get at the question about selves and others. But what's interesting about using this material is that Denkard 8 explicitly tells us that it is the table of contents of this vast bulk of lost literature that we no longer have. And let me put this in perspective. So, of these 21 nusks, we only have one complete nusk, the Vedanta, which has a complete Avestan and a complete Pahlavi. And when we compare the table of contents of the Vedanta in the Précis, so to speak, in Denkard Book 8, they are quite similar. Not identical, but close enough that they know what they're talking about in that sense. But a vast bulk of the other nusks that they refer to, we have very little evidence for them. We have words whose names we can't etymologize easily, but they have very detailed sections about, and what they essentially do is they just say, and in this one there's X, and the next topic is Y, and the next topic is Z and Z, and they move on and on and on. And so in a sense, what we're dealing with is a vast amount of literature that represents a web of traditional intersignifications. Various connections made as like a spider web between a particular section that you're looking at and all the other texts that we find, constantly being alluded to. So in a sense, our job is when we work on literature like this, is how do we historicize it, but how do we also put it into connections with the rest of the literature? Now, what Denkard 8 does is it essentially taxonomizes the religious tradition based on the 3 verse lines of the Yata'ahu Vario prayer. And in a sense, this taxonomy is something that we know not only from the ancient Avestan sources. We have one reference, also from the Pahlavi, but in the 17th century, Henry Lord, who was a preacher and connected with the East India Company, actually wrote a travelogue, so to speak, about the Parsis. And in that, he gave us a really fascinating, small little mention of these the division of the tradition into three parts. So I put it on here, and you can see the old archaic English spellings. So they affirm then that this book contained in it three several tracts, the first whereof treated of that which we call judicial astrology, foretelling the events of things to come by judgment of the stars, which by them is called Studigarnask, which is what I am producing my text edition of. The second treats concerning physics, or the natural knowledge of things with their causes, and the cures of the diseases to men. The third was called Zerdusht, because Zerdusht was the bringer thereof, and this contained their law. So, what we have here, in many senses, is basically the three divisions of the corpus, indexed to the three verse lines of the Yatha Ahuvariya prayer, the most sacred prayer in Zoroastrianism. And essentially, this is something that I guarantee every Zoroastrian will have had memorized and can do from memory. But what we see here, in a sense, is the text that I'm talking about. This is the schematic representation. So for each word of the Avesta, Yatha, they have a Nask, the Studga. And then the Nask has had an Avestan, and then had its Pahlavi translation. And then they essentially index each of the sections based on each word of the Yatha Ahuvariya. So you have 21 words, 3 verse lines, that is 3 gas, separate and by 7. So you have the good thoughts, words, and deeds in the 3, and this is the text mentioned. It's not just something I'm just saying. You have the 7 Amesha Spentas, and you get the 21 words, and that sort of creates the symbolic taxonomy. Now this is again something that I've talked about before, but I just want to lay this out here so you know where it is that I'm drawing the sources from. Because essentially what the texts are saying is that the passages I'm going to talk about come from up there. That is, they actually supposedly represented something that existed in Avestan once. And of course, this is the great challenge. If they existed in Avestan once, when they are referring to others, they cannot be the Sasanian world. But they are in fact working for the Sasanian world. And then, of course, we have the issue of now the material is produced and written down in the Islamic period. So you have Islam in the mix as well. So, transmission of the knowledge from the past. I just want to briefly sort of show you how reduced the corpus and how reduced the tradition had gotten in the time of when Pahlavi was basically produced. So in Din Card 8, we have a section that says, the Zand of the Nodar or Nakhtar, you can read the text, the name both ways, Nask, has not been transmitted to us, but its Avestan has come down by means of the priesthood, through teaching, memorizing, and use in rituals. So in this particular one, they don't have the Pahlavi commentary, but they claim to have the Avestan, which we now don't have. Whereas in other examples, they say the reverse, that they have the Pahlavi, but not the Avestan. And in some, they say both are lost. So we have the kind of a grab bag of how the material sort of survived. And we have this fascinating text about Sistan, which says, one Nask had been threshed and softened, that is learned by heart, be it by women, be it by a child. And in that way, the Dane was again ritually performed in Sistan and was restored and redressed ever anew. But except for Sistan, in other places, it was not solved. And the argument here is that there were bottlenecks in the tradition. That is, large material was lost. Now, this seems kind of hard to understand, but it's really important to realize that when we're talking about Sasanian Iran, we are almost exclusively talking about the memory capacity of priests. So if a priest has a heart attack, the Avesta is gone. I mean, it's just worth keeping, it's very basic. So the power of orality is that it's conservative, because the priest decides who he wants to teach. The downside is, if a priest has a health problem, if a priest dies, if a priest converts, if a priest is killed, you essentially lose your local walking, talking Avesta, and also all the Pahlavi literature, the knowledge that they had. So it's not impossible that something like this process could have occurred, whereas in certain regional areas, they had lost their priests. And essentially the text basically said that they were put together in a kind of something like a synod and reconstituted. Now, of course, this is what I'm talking about is what the texts say about themselves. From the philological perspective, that doesn't always match. Sometimes what we see philologically looks quite profoundly different. That is, from a linguistic perspective, where like that argument can't hold, this argument can't hold. But I just want to lay out how the tradition understands itself. Because I think that's has rather been essentially elided in the history of Zoroastrian scholarship. Or it's been done in an exceedingly piecemeal sort of way. So, I'll just very briefly show you how the text understands its own transmission, before I actually get to the passages that are, properly speaking, what I think may or may not be Sasanian. Professor Gross did tell me, oh, get to the point, don't just go all over the place, but, can't help myself. So, now, the text says, about the book of Denkard, and this is we have a small section of explaining the history of the Denkard in the Denkard. This is in the end of book 3. About the book of Denkard from the exposition of the good Dane. That is, the written Denkard is a portion of what is revealed from the Mazdian Dane, which is adorned with the knowledge of all things. And firstly, there are extracts which come from the good Dane of the teachers of old, the first disciples of Zardusht, of the Spitavans, who brought the word of the one whose pre-soul, Frabahab, is worthy of sacrifice, containing the wisdom and knowledge of all issues as revealed in the good Dane and obtained by Zardusht, by asking and listening to this one, Ormast, whose pre-soul is worthy of sacrifice, Frabah. Like light which comes from the original light. Now, text continues. And the exalted ruler, Kevishtas, commanded that those original questions and decisions be set down in writing from beginning to end, that they be consigned to the gubernatorial treasury, and that copies be distributed appropriately. From then on, copies were sent to the fortress of books, and the knowledge was kept there as well. And we know nothing about what these actual institutions may or may not have been. There's been tremendous amount of speculation that this may be one of those sites at Nakshe Rustam, the Kabe Zardusht, and all sorts of various other claims. And I'm sure Professor Kanepa would be able to sort of debunk 90% of them. But, and during the disasters which came to the land of Iran, and the Dane and the kingship, that is Dane and Huadai, from the miserable villain Alexander, that copy in the fortress of books was burned, and the one in the treasury fell into the hands of the Romans. Now, of course, they refer to Alexander in the context of anachronistic, they refer to him as a Roman, of course, because their enemies are the Byzantines, and so essentially there's a kind of, they're fighting the Romans and Byzantines, and it's a bit anachronistic. But he's consistently called Chromai. And it was also translated into the Greek language from the knowledge that was transmitted from the ancients. And this is something really fascinating. The Iranians always say that everything the Greeks got, they got from us. Basically, they stole it and they took it. And it's fascinating simply because we have so much material connected with Greek philosophy and Greek medicine that exists in Pahlavi, which we strongly believe came into the Iranian world a second time, so to speak, when you have some of the Neoplatonic philosophers and physicians and such who came, and they came from the less tolerant sort of West and settled, and we have a really fascinating text talking about a debate between Khusro and various of these Neoplatonic thinkers. So, and that Lord Ardashir, king of kings, son of Babak, came to restore the kingship of the Iranians. This book was brought from its scattering to one place. The righteous Tansar or Tosar, depending how the name is written, we don't know anything about this person. One of the teachers of old, who was the chief instructor, Herbedan Herbed, came upon it, and the king ordered him to compare the book with the revelation from the Avesta or the Avestan, and to complete it from that revelation. And it was done likewise. He commanded that it be kept in the treasury, like it was a piece of brilliance which came from the original light, and a copy of the knowledge is to be suitably distributed far and wide. Now, after the harm and destruction the Arabs brought upon the archive, the Divan, of Dewan in Pahlavi, and the national treasury, the Ganj, as well, the blessed Adul Fanbai, son of Farrokh-Zad, leader of the Mazdians, reassembled with renewed strength those dispersed copies in the archive of the court, by inspecting and comparing them with the Avestan and Zand of the Good Dane and the words of the teachers of old. He then restored it, as it were, to a glimmer from that brilliance. By the horrible turmoil and harm that befell Zardusht, son of Adul Fanbai, who was leader of the Mazdians, the archive was destroyed as well, and the book was torn up and scattered and damaged and fell into disuse and began to deteriorate. Now, we think this horrible turmoil is that Zardusht converted to Islam. And so, hence, you had, again, another bottlenecking problem. Now, and since then, I, Adul Bad, son of Ahmed, leader of the Mazdians, hastened by the gods with the assistance of the Mazdian Dane, with renewed strength, turned to seeking out and examining at great pains this writing that had been recovered from that scattered and soiled archive, now in many places, some illegible which had been restored, then carried off and stolen and once again brought back. I made selections from it with the aid of my inquiring wisdom, my khrad, to guide me, again comparing it with what the teachers of old of the ancients had said and done, and what was revealed in the Avesta, and enlarged from the knowledge of the good Dane. I arranged it in chapters and subjects as a spark which comes from the glimmer of that brilliance, which is in turn from the light of the original light. And guided by the good Dane, I redacted this, which was named as a proxy, a stool, of, as it were, that great original, the Dane card of 1,000 chapters. Now, the reason to belabor this entire point and show you this is that this text actually gives us a really nice explanation for its own transmission. And so, in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm using this text for you guys today as a proxy of the transmission issues that we have when we look at Pahlavi literature. So someone would just say, well, if Pahlavi literature is all written down in the Islamic period, just use the material that you have in the properly Sasanian period. Therein lies the classic problem that has been addressed by Professor Gayori in an article from 2016, if I'm not mistaken, where essentially what constitutes Sasanian literature is we have inscriptions, we have seals, coins, bullae, we have papyri, produced by the Zoroastrian priests and produced by the imperial bureaucracy and the kings. We have the literature of Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, others, Romans and such, responding in the to what's happening in the Iranian world and neighboring areas. And we of course then have the later Persian and Arabic historians talking about the Sasanians. But for all practical purposes, Pahlavi literature as we know it doesn't really exist as its Sasanian corpus. It was produced in the Islamic period. Written down. So in that sense, and that's what I mean by produced, that it was finally redacted, as he explains, from all the various vicissitudes. So in this sense, if you want to talk about the ideological and political underpinnings, the religious underpinnings of the political actions of the kings, which people here have written about and done a great job, you eventually have to fall back on citing Pahlavi literature as the kind of explanation for why they believe what they do. And then you are back to this problem. So, it's a little bit long-winded, but I hope it sort of adds something to give us a little bit more nuance about when we're talking about these things. Because otherwise you have the constant problem of not knowing when things are from and essentially treating this material as if it's Sasanian when it suits us. So, I just wanted to show you here what one of the manuscripts looks like. So this manuscript is the oldest manuscript we actually have. The colophon is from 1020, but the manuscript it's in is a little bit later, the 1600s. And this manuscript was produced in Kerman. It is a fantastic manuscript. It has all sorts of readings that the other one doesn't have. It had been lost for 40 years. No one knew where it was until I went to Bombay and found it in a Godrej cupboard, sitting there gathering dust. They were very kind and they let me scan it. And if you look at the printed version that was printed in Iran in the 70s, and you compare it with what actually, this was in 2010, I think, you see a huge amount of destruction just in in the span of 40 years. So again, it's worth keeping in mind that we're talking about quite large periods for the actual physical copies of what constitutes the literature of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Iran. Now, finally, to the actual stuff. So, what I decided to do was I went through Denkardate and I tried to look for passages that essentially dealt with the topic at hand, that is, Selves and others. And I was struck by how many of these passages look, and I know this is extremely unscientific, but look, relatively speaking, Sasanian. By that I mean they talk about events not in the historical sense, but about things that clearly are, that happened, that look like they're still talking as if they are in charge. Now that is not by any means a sort of clear metric, or there's no easy way of saying, oh, just because it looks old that it is in fact old. But I'll show you some of the passages and then we can discuss. So this one I took from the Chirdad Nask. And a word about the rulership of the 7 continents, the evil rule of Dahak, his lineage back to Taz, the brother of Hoshang, and the father of the Arabs, Taziban. So of course, instantly we already have the Arabs on the scene. And knowledge of him and his time, the passing of the time which was from the end of the good rulership of Jam till the end of the evil rulership of Dahak, and the lineage which was from Jam to Freydon. A word about Freydon, the ruler of Huanira. All of this material has some version, as we know it much more popularly, in the Shahnameh. But we have here, and the apportioning of Huanira, that is the central continent, the central Khaim, Kishvar, to Sam and Tos and Erich, who were his 3 sons, and their union with the daughter of Padsrau, the king of the Arabs, and of the lineage of Taz, and the lineage in a word about each one separately. So now you can ask me, what the hell are you showing us that stuff connected with Arabs if we're talking about Sasanians? Well, continue. The rulership of Manushcher of the Iranians and of the family of Erich, the expiation of Afrasiab, monarch of the Turanians, and Uzal, the Tumaspian monarch of the Iranians. Many of these people are quite obscure, of the or at least they're obscure in the Pahlavi context, of the family of Manushcher, K. Kawad, ancestor of the Kayanids and ruler of the Iranians, the expiating of Lord Kersasp, and Keus, descended from Kawad, lord of the 7 continents of the Kayanids, and K. Khosrow, son of Kisiavash, lord of the continent of Huanira. Again, all of this is quite well known to Iranians and Parsis as well from the Shahnameh. And a word about the many particular races, Tokhmak, namely the Iranians, the Turanians, and those of Salman, even up to Lord K. Lurasp and the monarch K. Vishtasp, the prophet of the Mazdian religion, Zardusht the Spitamid, and the passing of the time which was from the first reign of Freydon up to the coming of Zardusht to the conference, that is when he first talked to Hormazd. And the many races and words which have been enumerated forth from within that same Nask and was found within it. It is genealogized, this is how I've translated Gori Hist, as for instance the Sasanians. It enumerates them as being well created and their rulership. Now, all of this just to give you the Sasanians, because essentially, if you take out the Karnamag Yarda Shiri Pabagan, you have almost no references to the Sasanian dynasty in Pahlavi literature. Now, how can that be? It makes no sense. Except for realizing that Pahlavi literature is really the priestly view of the past. So they do talk about the kings, and we do have plenty written about Sasanian monarchs in the context of the transmission of the sources and things like that. But for the most part, they really don't, the Sasanians don't really factor into Pahlavi literature. But what's interesting is how they put these sources together. They have, what you see is something akin to the history of Iran as we find it in the Shahnameh, but in a hyper-compressed form here. And we have the famous, the Iranians, Turanians, and we have the reference to Salman, which of course sounds like what?
Islam?
Yes. And there you would be not correct. Because it's actually found from the Avesta. This is a section pulled out from the Avesta, where we have in Yasht 13, in the Fravardin Yasht, where it says, Airyanam, Dakyunam, Naram, Ashaunam, Fravashayo, Yazamaide. Yazamaide, we sacrifice to the Fravashis, the pre-souls of the truthful men of the Aryan lands. We sacrifice to the pre-souls, the Fravashis of the women of the Aryan lands, men of the Turian lands, women of the Turian lands, men and women of the Cyrenian, that's probably the best way we can do it, lands. So here's a classic example of what happens when we're dealing with Pahlavi literature. That is, we have something that is properly speaking, pre-Islamic, hyper-archaic, reimagined, and put into a new context for the early Islamic centuries. Now, this raises the great question. The same people who are reciting this text also are producing the scholastic literature. We know that, and we know that the scribes and the people who copy the manuscripts are often exactly the same. Not in every case, but in enough number of cases, especially with the Denka, because we know that some of them copied the Pahlavi Yasna and things like that. So clearly, they know these things. So this is the interesting aspect of it. That is, one part of the tradition is essentially being modernized, being made sort of new, whereas the actual Avestan is still kept hyper-archaic. Now, whether they understood that there were two different groups, whether they did this consciously, or whether this was just essentially seen as an undifferentiated past, it's hard to say. But I purposely went looking for this example because this captures, in a nutshell, the problem that we have when we're translating and working with Pahlavi literature. And when we're talking about the Iranians and the Turanians, we get one of the great early sort of distinctions between self and other. It is worth keeping in mind that when we look at the names of these Turanians, so to speak, in the Avestan sources, their names are what we would call, in the modern sense of the term, in the modern linguistic sense, they fit Iranian ethno-linguistic names. Which means that when they're calling them someone else, it is really Iranian-speaking tribes calling themselves Aryans, and then Iranian-speaking tribes who call themselves Aryans calling the others Turanians. That is, it's not that their names are in some other language or that they're in some substrate dialect or from Central Asia or anything like that. These are all what we, from a kind of historical linguistics and dialectological perspective would call Iranian-speaking peoples. That being said, we have to be extremely careful because ethnicity and language, they don't go together. There is plenty of, my name is Yuhan, it's a Semitic name, I don't have a so-called Semitic background, so, yeah. To the next section. So, also, this is all from Descartes. About the decision which is regarding the propriety of giving clothes and armor and things to non-Iranians, and giving them service in the arranging of work, and whatever else help and gratitude regarding that which is over and above the help and gratitude given to drunkards. So, I'm not quite sure what this means, but I really wanted to put this in there because it captures something. I'm not quite sure what. Here is something that we also, is what we find in this material, which is that we have references to non-Iranians. And here, unlike in some of the other examples, which are quite relatively straightforward of non-Iranians being bad, here we talk about help to non-Iranians. This is, in many senses, a tricky question, because when we're talking about giving clothes and armor and things, can this be historicized to a particular event connected with either a client tribe of the Sasanians or connected with any of the other groups that they would have co-opted into their military? I don't know, but this is what we have. Another one from the Nigadonian Husk, about the disputation of an Iranian with a non-Iranian, non-Iranians with an Iranian. And I've tried very hard to translate Iran as the land, or Iranians, and not as Iran. and because I've tried to keep un-air for Iranian. Mostly works, not all the time. A slave, bandag, with a man of the country, mardi shah, with regard to an item of value, whatever else is within the same chapter. So here again we see just this extremely terse explanation. The section above is something completely different, the section below is completely different. This is what we have to sort of work with, or at least I have to work with. So, and then we have about how long is the duration for the seeking of a physician among the Iranians, if afterwards, through not being able to obtain one, having the authority to seek one from even the non-Iranians. So the question being asked is, how long do you have to wait before you can go and get a non-Iranian doctor? So, the sin of when one finds a physician among the Iranians, yet seeks one from the non-Iranians. About the salary, missed, paid to a non-Iranian physician, and many other things within the same chapter. So this is again kind of interesting, and I think this is one of the only references that I've seen to what we think is the reference to the Greek physicians being at the court of the Sasanian king. Now we have that material and the reference to them in the Western sources, but we really don't have that in Pahlavi. At least I've never seen it. Turaj? Simco? No. Seen it anywhere in Pahlavi? So. And this is precisely the kind of way this literature operates. They ask a question, but we don't even actually get the payout answer that says, oh, you have to wait X number of days. Sometimes we have it, but in this sort of this style of this genre, we don't get that. So another one. I wanted to show you something from Dinkart 3, just to capture a little bit of how some of these physicians, probably Greek physicians, they may have also had a sort of Syriac connection, how the influence they had into Pahlavi literature. So when the creation is brought back from excess to the mean, Peyman, this is the Aristotelian mean, and is led deficiency to the mean, every action is saved in wisdom by the Mazdian Dane from all evil, and is brought over to the all-encompassing goodness, the pure lawfulness. So here is a classic example of what they have done. They've taken Aristotle's golden mean and they've read it into the Pahlavi literature as being encoded already in the Dane from time immemorial. And I have another one here. In the Dane, this is from Dinkart 3 again. In the Dane, he is named as a demon worshipper, Devast, a heretic, Ahlamok, an un-air, that is a non-Iranian. And in the discourse of the land, Ewazi Shah, they call them sophists, sophistag, and atheists, Dakhrik. And this we can clearly see with the Dakh form that we're dealing with an Islamic era reading of the Arabic word here for those who believed in a timeless past and such, uncreated past. And so without, that is time immemorial without actually having a creator deity. But again, here we see precisely how fluid these categories are. That is, you get demon worshippers, you get heretics, and non-Iranians all being put together in a rather indiscriminate sense. But you also have the reference to the Greek, the sort of the Greek influence in the Sasanian period, and of course then we get the Islamic era reading of the same groups. That is, people who are essentially problematic for the moral rectitude of the normative way of handling the Iranian world, or living in the Iranian world. So, here's another one. A miscellaneous section, Brinagi Amechtab, about seeking an assistant who is brought. That is, in what manner is it good? The salary of the assistant who is a citizen, Dah, and that of one who is a non-Iranian. Again, this is what we have. Clear distinctions being made between self and other, between those who are Dachen, that is citizens, and the translation of this was actually put forth in the late 19th century by Gelden, who argued for this particular reading of this word. So, I want to transition a little bit from the Iranian, non-Iranian, to foreign wives and new brides. Others as well. So, here, about causing the conveying of a young woman from the house of her family, literally her father's, that is in plural, or guardians, to the village of her husband in order to hold the position of the mistress of the house of the husband. About a wife when she becomes reverent and pleasing to him. But, and I supply the but, the admonishing of her when she says, I am your wife, but I will not perform a wife's duty for you. Bedroom duty, just to be clear. The disputing of a husband with his wife, and the undertaking of punishment. So, again, extremely sort of terse. But this is something that we see all over the Pahlavi literature. The idea that we have these sections where women complain and say that they're not going to do sort of what their domestic duties, and the response from the Zoroastrian priesthood in terms of how this is problematic from a Zoroastrian perspective. So, another one here. About the propriety of a woman with regard to her testimony and judgment when she is a guardian over her own self. That is, she doesn't have a male guardian or a father, that she is basically self-governed. And with regard to the authority of her husband. Versus, this is supplied by me, the impropriety of a woman being non-Iranian and being worthy of death for even a single offense, whatever is within the same chapter. So, here again we have the reference to Selves and others, and the non-Iranian woman has a very, very short rope. This is a passage that I came across after I had found another passage that I've been working on, which I've been working on for quite a while in Denkard 3. So I'll show you that to give it a little bit more, give this passage a bit of context. And this is a passage which says, with wives from outside, that is foreign brides, one can see their subservience and helplessness, their eagerness to serve their husbands so that they do not commit any offense, the resignation they muster against the husband's harshness, and many other things. Now, this is one of 3 types of women that are listed. And Turaj, if you remember the talk that I gave in Oxford in 2014, you see that essentially that the other types of women are the ones who demand a lot of money, and they demand nice clothes and a nice house, and they refuse to have sex with their husbands, and they have the 3 types of women essentially. And these are the sort of the docile foreign brides. But here again we get just a little taste of something that we would call the intimate life of the early Iranian world. We just don't have a lot of material. We have a lot of material about punishments, we have a lot of material about legal mechanisms for divorce, marriage, and those things. But very little about the actual domestic sort of give and take, or in this case mostly just take. But so I want to transition from that, and again, these are just little snippets here and there, but I'm trying to sort of excavate out the most amount of material that we can get for various different social categories. So here I want to talk about boarders, hostages, and captives, because this is something, this really surprised me. I didn't expect to see so much of this material in a text like Denkard 8, which is supposed to be about, the ancient scriptures passed down. But about the proportion of those who hold weapons as combatants after a victory over the non-Iranians, and from among the combatants, the recapturing of hostages and captives from the non-Iranians, and the repatriating of them. And again, this is all we have. There's nothing more, it doesn't say anything more, it just goes to the next topic. But here we have, again, a little taste of something that is hard to argue as being something that they would put together in the post-Islamic 650 moment, when essentially they probably wouldn't have the ability to make to have this kind of military campaigns. Though of course Professor Daryori has written about what some of the Sasanian courts in exile did when they came back and they took a little bit of Eastern Iran for 20, 30 years. Right? But I don't sort of anticipate that that's what we're dealing with here. Here's another one. About the border peoples, Mahrazana, being given as hostages to the non-Iranians who sought a treaty, and about the devaluing of even a thing which is precious to a non-Iranian and was of growing value when they give it to Iranians as ransom, and the greater worth of an arrow. The word looks exactly like an arrow, but the context doesn't make a great deal of sense here. Edward William West suggested that this may be a young boy, but I don't see how that really works, but it would fit the context. When they take it from the non-Iranians as a hostage in the place of ransom, just like the keeping of both. And about the grievous sinfulness of a man who steals back a hostage from the non-Iranians, even if it is his son. So this is another example of something that we actually have and we know quite well from the ancient Avestan material, from the Miryasht, that is Yash 10, where it basically says that if you make a deal, a contract, with someone who's an evil person, and they break their end of the deal, you don't get to break your end of the deal. So in this particular context, you've given your son as a hostage. You can't then quietly go back and sneak him out and bring him back, even if this is your son and you're doing your sort of, paternal duty. So, now, next one. And about that which happens when non-Iranians arrive to the border of Iran. And this time I've translated Iran as Iran, because I think we meant here, but even the form is a bit iffy. Causing damage upon Iran or Iranians, Margraves, that's Maz Banan, and their fellow troops, Ham Gundan, hold back the non-Iranians through fighting, which leads to the saving of the Iranian people, literally their body, and their property, which were being made non-Iranian, whatever is within the same chapter. So again here, what we seem to get is some references to something like would fit the context of all the major border skirmishes that we have in the Sasanian period, either in the West, or even with the Turks and the Huns out in the East. I mean, it's really unclear. I don't think there's any particular way of historicizing it, or at least I don't have any particular way of doing it. And I just want to end with this small little one. About the march of an army which is in the state of fear, and versus that which is in the state of fearlessness, which is the distinction of the armies of the Iranians from that of the non-Iranians. And this one is an interesting passage because the term for army is not the usual Pahlavi term, but it's lashkar, which looks like it's properly Islamic period. And what's interesting is if you read this in the classically sort of grammatically parallelistic way as Pahlavi operates, it really translates the way I have done it. That is, you have the ravishin, the marching, the coming of an army which is in a state of fear, tadbin, versus one abe bini, that is without being in a state of fear. And then if you put that parallelistically, what comes after, it's lashkari Iran and an Iran. So it looks like what they're saying is that actually the Iranian armies were afraid and the non-Iranian armies weren't afraid. And this, given the actual, the use of the Arabic sort of context here, suggests to me that what they have done here is they're sort of explaining why their armies fell, that they were too afraid to actually fight. Now, it's just speculation. But grammatically, there's no other way to read this. I mean, whether you want to take it as that, or you just want to take it as something that existed before and they've substituted one of the Pahlavi term that they would have typically used, haim or something like that, for lashkar, that's a different question. So, wolves and others. I'll just do this quite quickly because I think I'm doing okay on time. The third section, and this text is called the Durz Sar Ozad, which is the striking of the thief on his head, Nask. It's a bit of a strange title, you sort of wouldn't expect it, but this is probably one of those Nasks that would have primarily focused on all the punishments given. So probably what they did is they take the title from the first of the punishment, that is the striking of the thief on his head, and then they extract that out. And that's typically how Pahlavi titles have operated. The third section, the warrior code, Artesh Tarestan, is particularly about the worthiness of striking the wolf. Among wolves, the greater need is for the striking of the two-legged ones rather than the four-legged ones, so werewolves. This is another very strange passage. People have written quite a bit about it. Antonio Panaino has written recently about this, I think, as well. And we have another passage, and about how they carry away the wealth of the non-Iranians, and this which is revealed from it, that is the Nusk. And they then give a quote. Which one is a wolf towards me, and which one is a friend? Man che gurg, che ayar. That is friend or helper or whatever. So, now what's this all about? We actually have an Avestan fragment connected with the Vedanta that actually gives us this small little reference to these two-legged wolves. This is all the fragment has, 3 lines. And he who kills him, Ospitama Zarathustra, the two-legged wolf, Bizangre, that is bipedal in that sense. The demon sacrificer, Daiwa Yasna, whose body is forfeited, Pasho Tanvi. So, so here again we see what on the surface, if you don't look at Avestan, you can see something that just fits the kind of the late antique, larger context of late antique and early Islamic larger context of Pahlavi literature. But so many of these things actually have allusions back in the ancient scriptures. In this case, some section that we have that's only like this big. We have a bunch of fragments that have one sentence, half a sentence, a few words that are not really, we're not able to place them within any of the existing texts. So they're clearly from what we think is the lost literature, if you see what I'm saying. Now, here we have a text that we know quite well, the Herberistan, which is one of the really nice texts because it has an Avestan and a Pahlavi translation. The Avestan text says, he gives a tongue to a wolf who teaches the sacred word, that is the mantra, to an unbeliever, someone who's Zrazda. Now, okay, again, keep in mind, this is the Avestan, so this is way, way, way archaic. Whereas the Pahlavi has something quite similar. It says, he gives a tongue to a wolf who teaches the sacred word to one, and then it adds a gloss in the square brackets. On air, a non-Iranian, who does not give it currency, or doesn't make it go forth. And then there's another gloss added. Ast ke gurg akhlamo goed. There is one who says the word wolf, gurg, is an akhlamo, a heretic. So here what we see is the classic technique that the Zoroastrians use, where they take the wolf, which is the paradigmatic evil animal, the contrast of the good dog, and they read the wolf as being connected with, that is, you don't teach someone who is an unbeliever because they are a wolf, they're fundamentally untrustworthy, and the Pahlavi clearly says that these are, what they're referring to is non-Iranians. Now, this is interesting because it suggests that this is something that would have happened. Now, our colleague Shai Sekunda has actually written about some of this material, and so I'll just show you a kind of a parallelism taken straight from his article, which basically, it's not about the wolves per se, but just to see how another late antique community responds about the Magi. So, from the Babylonian Talmud, Rav Zutra bin Tuvia says that Rav said, he who pulls the thread of a seam on the Sabbath is liable a sin offering. He who learns something from a magus is worthy of death. And he who knows how to calculate cycles and planets and does not, it is forbidden to converse with him. And then he has another passage that he cites in the article. As to Magianism, Rav and Shmuel disagree. One said that it is sorcery, the other said blasphemies. It may be proven that it is Rav who maintains that they are blasphemies. For Rav Zutra bin Tuvia said that Rav said, he who learns something from a magus is worthy of death. Now should you think that it is sorcery, surely it is written, and then they cite Deuteronomy, you shall not learn to do the aberrant practices of those nations. Implying, but you may learn in order to understand and instruct. This proves it. So, I just put this in there because when Shai wrote the article, he did cite the Hebelistan section, but the Descartes 8 passages and the fragment really kind of, I think, pull it together and add a little bit to the rounding out of this particular literary trope. Now, just one more. And about the union, Hami, of those of the good religion altogether, in the rejecting of misery and in union even with infidels. I just translated it in the old-fashioned way because I think it kind of captures something quite evocative. So literally it's those of the evil Dane, Al-Dainan, with regard to that which is not injurious to the religion, that is to the Dane, whatever is within the same chapter. And here again, the question is when they say union, what are they talking about? Is this in the domestic context? Is this in the context of apostasy? Is this in the context of learning? It's hard to know. So, let me just turn briefly to a topic that is quite obvious, quite sort of emotional for many living Zoroastrians, that is miscegenation and mixed families. So the Husparom Nask says, about the making of a family, literally a lineage, Gochrig, with non-Iranians. That is, how it is when it is authorized. That's all they say. And then they follow with I just wanted to show you how fugitive these things are. The next section just goes on to say about an animal of good breeding for a period of 3 nights. After 3 nights it's slaughtered. Likewise many legal decisions regarding superiority in animals of good breeding. And that's it. So what we have here is the possibility of unions with non-Iranians, the possibility of it being authorized, and essentially then the next section is about breeding. So this is clearly connected with their understanding about admixture. I don't want to go so far as to use the word racial admixture because I think that's a problematic and loaded modern term, but clearly admixture between, let's leave it as communities. Here's another one. About the blood which is on a woman that needs washing, and the punishment which comes upon him who has sexual intercourse with a woman who needs washing, and who is non-Iranian, and any other who is not authorized for sexual intercourse. So that is menstruating women and non-Iranians, and people you're not supposed to be having sex with. And a woman who grants sexual intercourse to non-Iranians. The mixing of semen and other sins which she commits regarding the same matters. So, here again we see a clear connection with another one of these traditional intersignifications. They say shusa, which is semen, gumezishni. And gumezishni, as many of you guys would obviously know, is the state of mixture that we find in the Zoroastrian Pahlavi literature about the mixed world that we live in between good and evil. But here they're using gumezishni for the mixture of the semen between presumably an Iranian man and the non-Iranian man blending together and presumably being problematic for paternity. So, that's what I have for that. And I just want to end basically with just a couple of other passages just to sort of round out and explain that, and sort of suggest that just because of the passages I showed you are not by any means sort of representative. In a sense, no passage is representative because the corpus is so varied that you can find basically anything within it to serve the various positions that you have or that you might be interested in. So, here's one that I think is quite interesting. And they hold this too, and they is here the teachers of old, the ancient sages. The Jews are not wicked merely on account of their Jewish scriptures. That is, Ewaz Yahudi. And followers of other bad religions, Abdain, are likewise not wicked merely on account of their bad religious scriptures. And that's it. They don't say any more. But this is again interesting because what we have here is, I wouldn't go so far as to claim that this is tolerance, but it's definitely not absolute intolerance either. Now, having said that, this is in Descartes book 6, which is the sixth book of the Descartes. Basically is the genre of Andar's literature, that is wisdom literature designed to tell people how to live well. Having said that, much of the material is Andar's literature is well documented, and it's a popular genre in Persian and Arabic, so there's nothing saying that this couldn't be something that could have been produced in the post sort of 650 period. I mean, there's no way of knowing it one way or the other, but it is interesting to see that they actually do this, and of all the communities they mention the Jews, whereas they could have talked about some other community theoretically, the Manichaeans, the Mazdakites, Christians. So, a couple more. This one is a passage that I think is I find very, very interesting, and so why did God, Yazd, send the Dane to the land of the Iranians only and leave the others to the teaching of the demons? And does he not consider the other gods deserving? That is, the Abari Yazd. Or can he not exhibit it to them? So, and this is in Descartes book 5, where we have this question and answer genre, where essentially questions are posed to the priests about the power and the kind of the glory of the religious tradition, and sort of by essentially saying, well, can this happen, can this not happen? And the answer, and Ormuzd the creator did not send this Dane only to the land of the Iranians, but to the entire world and to all kinds of people. And it was set in motion throughout this world, in both pure and mixed form. And here again we get the mixture, the gumezagi ha. In the other world, it goes forth by natural knowledge, chihrik, and true thought and speech. And in this world, by true deeds, among whomsoever. So, here we see a much more universalizing approach to the notion of self and other. And again, it's hard to know when precisely to historicize this type of argument, but we have it. And then just to continue. It goes forth in such a way that even someone of the more evil Dane, Al-Dane Tag, sets great store, this is a bit hard to, the translation is a bit vague here, by this Dane. But in this state of mixture, such as it is now, it cannot go forth entirely in pure form, but by struggling. And this Dane will keep increasing, and its opponent keep decreasing, that is probably the opponent being Ahriman, until the Dane is spread completely, and thereby the world will arrive to purity. So, here we essentially have something very much quite common actually in Pahlavi literature, which is a sort of essentially positive eschatological view about the final triumph of good over the forces of evil. Thank you.